Hi, everybody. Cassandra Keller. I'm our Community Options Benefits Section Manager.
Hi, everyone. I am Victoria Rogers, and I am the HCBS Residential Benefits Specialist. Nice to have you all.
Thank you. And thanks, everyone, for joining for our stakeholder meeting for Host Home Oversight. During this meeting, we are recording and we will be monitoring the chat as well. If there's any questions that come up that we're unable to answer at the time, we will get back to you with that information. Okay, Victoria, next slide. So our mission here at HCPF is to improve the healthcare equity, access, and outcomes for people we serve while saving Coloradans money on healthcare and driving value for Colorado. Next slide. And today's agenda, we already did introductions. We do have a few members from Mission Analytics that are on the phone, on the presentation with us as well. They are our contracted vendor who has been doing the environmental scan and helping us with this process. So they'll be popping in here and there to go over a few informational points from their environmental scan. We are going to review the summary, review the provider requirements that we've gone over, as well as the provider training, monitoring, logistics, and at the end, we will talk about focus groups and next steps. Next slide. Go ahead and go to the next slide. Okay, so a review of the provider requirements that we have discussed so far.
Hey, apologies, 1 second. It does sound like we're getting some echo, so can you please all just make sure and check that your microphone's muted? That should help with any of that background noise. Thank you.
Thank you, Cassie. So we're talking about background checks. In the past meeting, we did cover quite a bit of information about what is required at this point and what some of you all are doing for your agencies when it comes to background checks. Primarily, most program approved service agencies do require federal background checks and DMV checks. Some of you are doing fingerprinting as well. What we'd like to know from all of you is, with the background checks, how are you feeling about the effectiveness of the background checks? And specifically, I'll let Mission Analytics get into this in a moment, but we'll be talking a little bit about whether or not you feel that a standardized list of non-hireable offenses should be developed. So I'm going to let let's see, who from Mission Analytics would like to kind of go over some of the talking points from the environmental scan?
This is Peggy O'Brien-Strand. I will start, and JP or Kathy may jump in and help add a little bit more context. So for the environmental scan, we looked at 9 different states that represented a range of different approaches in terms of being both more rigorous and in some cases less rigorous than Colorado. But all of the states did require background checks, and they actually required them of all adults in the home. About half of them were actually fingerprint based, so 5 out of 9. The other 4 were just name-based checks. And as Victoria has listed here in the slide, most of the states, or many of the states anyway, have a list of offenses that exclude providers, and you know, they tend to be pretty serious different issues. So you know, if somebody hits one of those offenses on a background check, they are not allowed to be a provider. So I'll leave it there, but we're happy to answer questions too.
Thank you, Peggy. So currently within the Colorado rules and regulations, there is not as outlined of a offense list of what would be deemed non-hireable offenses. Cassie, I believe we were going to do a poll on whether or not a specified list is something that providers would like to see, and if there's any kind of
Yep, I'll get that.
advertising. Thank you. Okay, next slide, Victoria. So most states will review the extent of the criminal record, the length of the time from the offense, nature of the offense, the degree of the person's participation in the offense, as well as personal references attesting to the person's rehabilitation since the offense. In California, there's stricter requirements than other states. If a background check, including ongoing background checks or information, reveals any offense beyond a minor traffic violation, the provider must request an exemption by the state to be approved. This is not currently something that Colorado has in place. And if anybody does have any questions or comments, as I mentioned, we are monitoring the chat and we'll have a later discussion. But if there's things specific to the information provided, we do want to hear from you. We do incorporate all of your stakeholder feedback into the ongoing process of this project. Next slide. A review of the provider requirements for DMV checks. Currently, much of the feedback received from you is that the DMV checks should be considered a standard practice and completed yearly. This would also assist providers in attempting to assist with providers who are attempting to utilize multiple names. Peggy, would you like to talk about the environmental scam?
I think JP was going to jump in on this, and JP, you may also want to reflect a little bit on the California case for this.
Yeah, if you don't mind just hopping back one slide. In our environmental scan, yeah, as it's mentioned here, California has one of the strictest requirements we found. So in California, absolutely any offense besides a minor traffic violation requires the provider to seek an exemption. And California actually also has an ongoing background check system. So they have a system that notifies the agencies, actually, the agencies and the Department of Disabilities department. They both get notified if somebody in their system commits an offense. So in California, if any offense other than a mild traffic offense is committed, the director of the department actually has to review the exemption request. So a provider would have to submit a request for exemption, and then the director actually has to review and decide whether or not to grant that request. And they also have, of course, a list of offenses that absolutely no exemption is possible for. And that looked pretty similar to the list, I think it was on the prior slide from Arizona, of offenses that automatically preclude getting a license. California has a similar thing there, but they won't grant exemptions for that. And I think, yeah, that was kind of all I wanted to add on that slide.
And JP, the California also applies to DMV, right?
Yes, it does. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Well, I think we have DMV in a few slides here. I can talk about that more in, I think in two slides here, we have some info about DMV.
Yeah, we're right here. That's where we were.
Okay. The next slide was DMV. Yeah. So we found that with DMV checks, it seemed like the primary concern was to be sure that the client has somebody who will provide safe transportation for them. Every state we found that required DMV checks actually also required a background check. So it seemed like the DMV check was really being viewed as a way to ensure safe transportation. And most of the states we found required a DMV check at initial certification and then often during recertification. New York would be an example of a state that has a stricter system. They have a license notification system. So any traffic violation automatically gets pinged to the host home agencies and I believe the state. So that the intent there is to ensure that safe transportation is being provided for the clients. That seems to be the primary function of the DMV checks.
Thank you. Next slide, Victoria. References. So this is something that we discussed last time as well. For professional references, this is feedback regarding professional references that was mixed. Ultimately, PASAs are requesting professional references for providers. However, there is difficulty surrounding this due to providers being contractors as employees, as opposed to being employees. And furthermore, the lack of information being provided in these references poses further issues into whether the truthfulness of the reference are beneficial to the agency. Universally, these are used. However, we understand that there tends to be a lack of information. And we do have a poll for this one as well. Do you feel that the reference checks are useful during the hiring process? JP, would you like to talk about the environmental scan?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. So we chose Arizona here. Oh, I should mention, so 5 out of the 9 states that we selected to really do an intensive review on, 5 out of 9 did request, or did require, I should say, reference checks. And in most cases, it was a reference check for the applicant. So that would be for the primary host home provider, the person who's applying for licensure or certification. And in many cases, it was very similar to the references that are required of almost any employment. They usually couldn't be blood or marriage related. And it is interesting to note that most required it only of the primary applicant, but we did find that Virginia, for example, actually required 3 non-family references for all adult members of the household. So that was a state that we found that had a little bit of a stricter requirement. But yeah, in general, the references are very similar to what you would find in other employment applications and are generally intended to talk to the applicants, to speak to the applicant's character and, as I mentioned here, their ability to care for individuals with disabilities. And also in Arizona, if an individual has experience working with people with disabilities, one of the references is required to be related to that experience. I think that was most of the notes I had on that slide.
Thank you. Next slide. One of the other things that has been talked about is a list of past host home providers that have been terminated for different reasons, and whether or not a list has been developed and whether that can be shared prior to hiring someone on. As a reminder, there is in the Colorado Code of Regulations 8.609.7.b a requirement of providers to notify the Department of Healthcare Policy and Finance if a provider is being terminated due to health, safety, or welfare concerns. This does need to be reported within 4 days to HCPF. And we have provided the link for the provider notification as provider termination notification form as well. The poll that has been entered in is whether or not your agency is actively using this list. Next slide. Training requirements. So most states have similar or the same requirements for providers to participate in, and from the results of the from the results of the environmental scan. The scan did reveal that many states require providers to participate in general state mandated employee training. However, it is the requirement and responsibility of the provider agency to ensure providers are participating in these mandated trainings and maintaining record of these trainings. Primarily, most trainings mandated by the state do offer some virtual and in-person class requirements. Is there anything that Mission would like to go over in regards to the training requirements?
I think this, in the interest of time, we won't say much. It covers a pretty broad range depending on states, but some of the states create the training, even though the provider agencies are required to sort of ensure that it's conducted. So there's a mix in terms of that. So I think that's the main point I would add.
Thank you, Peggy.
And Cassie, I think some people are having trouble seeing the poll. I don't know if you want to give instructions on how to get to the poll.
Yeah, thanks, Peggy. I think Christy put it in the chat, but in the bottom right hand is a triangle, a square, and a circle. And under those activities, it lists the poll. And you can see the polls that have been launched. You can respond there, and then you can also see how others are responding.
Thank you, Cassie. Next slide, please. So we wanted to go through the current monitoring requirements for PASA's case management agencies, as well as the Department of Local Affairs. So for PASA's, quarterly monitoring visits are required within the host home. There does need to be evaluation of the safety plans and evacuation procedures for each member that lives within the home, and it is expected that one unannounced visit per year will occur. For case management agencies, they are required to do quarterly monitoring visits face-to-face where the services are delivered. So that would be within the home, within day programs, supported employment settings, out in the community. And the level of care assessment, the 100.2, is separate from quarterly monitoring visits. So that does not count as one of those visits. HCPUF may also approve monitoring visits to take place in an alternative location via phone or other virtual technology methods, depending on the availability of team members to meet, as well as coming off of COVID. We've got very used to doing televisits. For DOLA, the Department of Local Affairs, inspections do take place within the first 90 days of a member placement for a host home setting. And inspections will then take place every 2 years following that. Next slide, please. We have made some proposed proposed changes to the requirements for monitoring for PASA's case managers and DOLA as well. So for the provider service agencies, the PASAs, we did suggest increasing the visits, the unannounced visits, 2 times outside of normal business hours. So in the evenings, on the weekends, times such as that. All visits are to be conducted in person and documented, which was a previous stipulation. And that documentation will also be reviewed by CDPHE every 3 years to verify during the survey that these visits have been taking place. For the case management agency, 1 unannounced visit per year, one in-person visit that cannot be combined with an unannounced or with the 100.2 or level of care meeting, 1 virtual visit, and the level of care or the 100.2 meeting does not count for any of the previously mentioned visits. And finally, for the Department of Local Affairs, will continue to be a requirement for inspections to be completed every 2 years. However, should a PASA or a provider fail to comply with this requirement, a payment suspension will take place until compliance is achieved. Okay, next slide. So before we get into the next steps, logistics, and all of that, I would like to open it up in case anybody has questions that they would like to ask to the group.
Meg, just a couple of things. One, we've been monitoring the chat. We will get to some of those things. I think there's a question or a comment, I guess, posed in here with Julie about this whole meeting is being about providers, obviously not about the people living in these places. And I think a lot of this approach has been, how can we provide or create stronger, better requirements on these provider agencies to ensure the health, safety, and welfare of members. And I think we are open to suggestions and would love to hear from you how we can make these conversations more member-centric, that are not provider-based and not provider regulation-based. So I would welcome any suggestions on how we can do that. And I think, we changed the format of this meeting. Last meeting, we did one topic, one slide at a time, and then ended up having not a lot of time at the end of the meeting for discussion. So we changed it. We just gave you a ton of information, ran through a lot. So apologies for that. We can kind of go slide by slide, but we want to hear from you outside of the chat. How are folks feeling about these things? If we did get quite a few respondents saying that they want to see they would like to see a exclusions list of hireable offenses. Are folks interested in developing that? Any thoughts on where we could look first to develop that list? Lots of things. Thank you, Abigail, for raising your hand to speak. I will hand that over to you.
Oh, thank you. My question is just around like if there's any exceptions or whatnot for, like, if you're a family caregiver. Like, I've been full-time since my son was born. And so eventually I'm going to be in the adult world, and I was thinking about doing and support the host home. But like I've already been doing it for so long, and he'll be one of the, I hope, one of the residents. So I just didn't know if there were any exceptions around that.
And Abigail, do you mean exceptions to any regulations for those family caregivers?
Like reference checking, maybe, if you had something more than a motor vehicle. In
Yeah.
fact, but I've already worked for Medicaid for so long, like, I guess, is there any exception for kind of that caregiver that is a live-in,
Yeah, I think that's a good question. And, historically, or the department tries not to differentiate between family caregiver and any other type of direct service provider. Technically you've been working for a provider agency, I would guess, rather instead of directly with Medicaid.
Correct.
We really hate to make carve outs to say this type of provider needs to have this or this type of provider needs to have that. Not to say that the group might feel otherwise and really strongly believes that family caregivers should have some carve outs for some of these requirements. So I would open it up to the group as well if they have other thoughts.
Thank you.
I don't know who is next. I think Joshua.
Joshua.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, there was a lot said here, so I'll pick some things to respond to. DOLA inspections being done every 2 years. Is that currently being done? I'm not familiar with any host home setting that's been surveyed or.
It is. They've been very slow on the rollout and ability to get inspections completed, but they are currently happening.
So a greater workforce to complete that work at that interval is needed, because most host homes that I know of have never been inspected for these health and safety challenges. Monitoring, oftentimes that I've seen it conducted by the case manager or by the residential manager, has been in the presence of other people, right? The direct care provider, the host home provider. And that can be challenging for someone to be able to talk about challenges in the presence of someone who maybe they're having a challenge with. So I think there needs to be more training and guidance around how to conduct a monitoring and ask the right questions to ensure people's health and safety, and any concerns are brought up. I'm sure there was more about monitoring. The reporting of termination due to health and welfare concerns. I'm not sure if that's widely understood by providers. I've known some people who have terminated someone from services, contract violations, health and welfare concerns that are not familiar with this. That was brought up to me even in this last week, and I brought that question back to colleagues on whether or not that is a requirement, and their understanding of it was not a requirement at this time. So that needs to be more transparent. The limiting financial contributions for a provider that is out of compliance can be harmful in a situation where a family caregiver is doing their absolute best, but is struggling to meet some of those requirements. And at the worst, it leads to a situation where the provider is then not being paid, and they can manipulate the person in their home to believe, as they believe, that they are not receiving fair compensation. And it leads people to this pasa hopping that needs to stop, because people are being manipulated and pulled out of services erroneously, being manipulated to leave their agency and go to an agency that provides less oversight. That's probably enough for me for now. Thank you for the time.
Thank you, Joshua. And I do want to clarify that when it comes to the proposal of suspending payments, this is typically a situation where host home settings for the Department of Local Affairs have not been provided at all. What we see quite often is that PASAs will communicate with DOLA that they have no current host home settings, that so therefore no required inspections, which we know not to be the case. And oftentimes when there is a conversation about a payment suspension, it's that a safety inspection has been scheduled, the inspector goes out to the home, and the host home provider will not allow them in after already agreeing to the inspection. If this happens multiple times, then we're having a greater discussion on whether or not there needs to be further actions to ensure that these inspections are happening. We don't do this with people that are making efforts in good faith. So in your example of a family caregiver that is working to bring a setting up to compliance, we would work with them to make sure that there is a plan in place and an action. We don't want to remove the individual from the home. That's our absolute last resort. This is more so for those that are skating by without following the same rules and expectations that we would expect from other PASAs. I hope that clears that up a little bit.
All right, I think Laura, you have your hand up.
Yeah, thank you. I like a lot of the stuff in here. I think when I take a really big step back and look at kind of one of the hopes that I have from this is that we're addressing the root cause of bad actors who are currently able to continue to move through the system when they're founded for Maine, when something really horrific happens and it doesn't meet the level of a criminal charge. So it's not going to show up on that background check. I think the CAP system has been really great because CAPS obviously checks and will find somebody for something that a criminal charge wouldn't. So I think that's really helpful. But when I take a step back, I feel like we're still not getting to the root cause, that these things still are not going to solve that bad actor from being able to move through the system. And so one of the questions I have is, one, the HICPA form for reporting providers who have been terminated for significant Maine allegations that have been founded. I think that should absolutely be mandatory. I didn't realize it wasn't. We were told it was mandatory, I think, shortly after it started. But that still doesn't go anywhere. So HCPF still doesn't have an ability, and I think we need to somehow find a way for HCPF to have an ability to see who those people are, for new PASAs to be able to be notified when that has been submitted for somebody, and for there to be real consequences. So not when CDPHE comes out in 10 years because they're so behind on surveys, but that a real-time system is there identifying when the new said PASA starts contracting with this provider who say, I terminated them for founded Maine allegations, and they're now being reported in Division of Housing's portal, that something happens there. And I think that's a really, really critical piece of this that we need to address, is that we have a good system with this, but we can't do anything with it. And I don't know where case management agencies fall into this. So we had a provider who was founded for Maine by us, by APS. They are currently working with another PASA right now. The case management agency was involved. They're still the case management agency for the people who are living in that home. And it just seems like we had this really great idea, but it can't go anywhere. So I just want to stress, I want to see something be able to occur with that system that we already have. And keeping in mind, some of these things are really great, and I think things that we do need to change within our system, but may not fully address one of the major issues that we have.
Thanks, Laura. I think I see lots of claps and various emojis going on. I think that's very much appreciated, and I think we can all agree that some of those bad actors moving around is really what the root of the problem is. We have been collecting those host home providers or independent contractors who've been terminated, and we maintain that list internally, and we have used the list to our advantage a few times. Let me just say, the problem we have with that list and a desire to have that published externally for anybody to look at is that there's no due process for that individual to be put on that list. So it could be that, Laura, you fired me because I am a real pain in the butt and you do not want me to work for you anymore, and I get put on that list, and it's more of a personality problem between you and me, but now I'm blacklisted and put on this list. So how do we balance ensuring the health, safety, and welfare of individuals by not having these bad providers out there, but also ensuring that due process? And so how we have used it so far in the past, and we really would like your help to kind of working also with our AG's office, trying to find the balance. How we use it in the past is when we know a host home provider has been terminated and is looking to move into a different area. For example, we might notify some of the surrounding PASAs in the Colorado Springs area. Hey, you should know this person has been terminated from prior PASAs. You might want to talk to your colleagues. So we've tried to kind of find that, thread that needle, but I think having a better policy with how we can utilize and better leverage that list is something we really would like to work through with all of you. Of in what instances does it make sense to notify prospective employers that this person is not someone you want to hire? Because I don't think we want just anything, kind of anybody getting on that list to be blackballed from other PASAs. But so it's just a really hard thing with providing that due process and then providing the necessary information to all of you other PASAs. So that was very long-winded, but that's kind of our struggle.
That makes sense. And I'm glad you guys are able to use it. And maybe one suggestion would be that if people are submitting that they have to submit the complete main file. So they have to have the GER, the critical, their internal investigation, the HRC review. So at least there is some backing. I know that's a workload then on the department to have to review that, but submitting that. So it's not just, you know what, I didn't like your shirt, so I'm terminating you and I'm going to submit this form and screw up your entire future as a provider, because I get that too.
I like that, Laura. That's helpful. Julie, I see you've got your hand raised, please.
Yeah, I think this is really important, and I'm wondering this, and I know that they're all contractors, not employees, but I'm wondering if CDLE might be able to help or share what process is used like in the employment setting. So like maybe there's a list of anyone who's been fired, but then there's the list of like people that shouldn't be rehired, and that's not based on the opinion of the prior employer, but of you guys or someone, because there's a difference between, because even if it's like, they didn't do their paperwork on time, well, maybe it was the PASA's paperwork system that they couldn't work with, or again, bad communication versus they mistreated a person, or they didn't provide, like they didn't follow medical care or whatever. Like those are two really different things. And so and then give them due process, like have a hearing, let them go to a hearing, and have a mediator, or an ALJ kind of thing. That it seems like you need to have that due process, because that is relevant. But again, this PASA hopping, and that is the root of this problem, is the bad eggs spoil the bunch.
Agreed. Thanks, Julie. I think at this point we don't have the infrastructure for such a thing, but that might be something that folks feel strongly we need to develop, and we need to ask for those resources.
Yeah, I think the legislation to do this committee was built on coming back and saying, what do you need to clean up the system? So I know you don't have the resources, but you have to, I think, first identify exactly what resources you need and how much, and then I don't think it would be a problem, because this was passed with a strong bipartisan support, and there is a lot of concern about this. So even though money's tight, I think we're spending a ton of money on the system. I think a lot of people end up in much higher levels of care because they don't get their needs met in the first place, or the second or third or fourth, and they end up developing these really complex behavior problems because they're in bad home situations.
Great. Deanna.
Hi, I just wanted to say that my experience with working with PASAs, with host home providers that are challenging, and I'm not talking about personality challenges, I'm talking about host home providers that aren't documenting medications, that are falsifying records, that are neglecting individuals, that have too many people in their home, but they get around with it. It's like a shell game. My experience with PASAs has been they have worked very hard to have people come into compliance. They've contacted APS, they've contacted law enforcement. APS won't open a case. Maybe never, maybe eventually, but I don't think it's a very flippant decision to dismiss a host home provider. That's been my experience. It's been a very long process to terminate a host home provider, because they have to go through, like a correction plan. So I don't think it's something that's happening quickly or for silly reasons. That's just been my experience with the 20 years in the field. But I wanted to say that there are host home providers that have never gotten onto a CAHPS list. Police were called, APS was called, maybe even an APS case opened, but it was not substantiated, most likely because there just was no, quote, evidence, because things are lost when an investigation isn't done quickly. But there are providers who have numerous citations, with Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment, or there's documentation there. And guess what? That provider is still in business. I know of 3 providers that, oh my goodness, I went all over the place trying to figure out they shouldn't be a provider. There was financial exploitation. In one case, one person died, but they are still providers. So I agree, there has to be some sort of database. And I think that if someone's terminated, they're terminated for this reason. Documentation is put into that database, but that's factual, right? That host home provider was terminated. That's That's not subjective, that's objective. There's a reason this person was terminated. Here's the documentation. I understand about the appeal process, and there has to be that balance. But ultimately, we're looking at Medicaid standards for health and safety. So I really think the balance has to be in favor of those most vulnerable individuals in host homes. And yes, we can provide some appeal process. Maybe they can demonstrate that they documented something, and that's going to take a database and monitoring. But we have to have some high standards in the state of Colorado. It can't always be the lowest bar, because I'm sorry, but right now we are living with some pretty low standards, and host home providers are getting away with it, and they're very savvy, and they know how to get away with it, just like Josh had mentioned. So we have to raise the bar, and I know that puts the onus on PASAs, but we also have to raise the bar on PASAs. We have to have good quality services. I work with people that come from other states, and they are blown away at some of the lack of standards. And I don't want to beat a dead horse, but it is alarming. I don't think that HCPF understands that in the field, what some host home providers are doing is criminal, but the police won't get involved and APS won't get involved, and they bounce from PASA to PASA. And I will stop with that.
Thanks, Deanna. Much appreciated. Ellen, I see you've got your hand raised.
Thanks, Cassie. And I sort of wanted to echo what Julie said earlier. I think you, in these meetings so far, I think we've really focused in on what HCPF currently has the regulatory authority to change. And then we have been sort of the first to say, and I think would continue to be the first to say, that we don't think you can use the existing termination list to, cut providers out of business because there is no due process. But I also think that it's an appropriate role of this committee, as directed by the legislation, to provide recommendations that maybe that's something we need to look at, that HCPF doesn't currently have the authority to do that, but we should look at what it would take to create a system to exclude certain bad actors. So just wanted to provide some support for that, because we are hearing from our members within Alliance that there's a major concern about these providers who are just jumping to other PASAs who aren't as interested in regulatory compliance as they are. Thank you.
Thanks, Ellen. I think that's both from you and Julie. I think that's a good, helpful call out, that having conversations about what infrastructure, what regulatory authority we need is helpful. I think we've heard pretty loud and clear that there's a desire to have a list that's published. And so I think trying to figure out what we would need in order to make that happen is something we definitely want to explore. We've got about 14 minutes. I see lots of great conversation in the chat. Are there other things that folks want to discuss? I think one of the things that we talked about last time and talked about it again this time is about the reference checks. I think interestingly is folks do feel like reference checks are helpful, but last time it kind of seemed like they were hard to come by and not all entirely useful. So I think it would be helpful to know if folks have a strong opinion one way or the other of, is this something that would be helpful to incorporate? Is this something that would be helpful if we made a requirement for PASAs, or is this something that should just go on the list as a best practice for agencies to utilize? I think that would be a helpful feedback. Laura.
We do reference checks. I think part of the issue is people can put somebody, right, that they know is going to give them a good reference, and there's no requirement and there's no way for us to know that they're listing a previous PASA that they worked for. So I think there's just downfalls in it. I think it's still a good best practice to have. But I don't know that I can fully give you a lot of information, because if they were terminated from another PASA or were let go on bad terms, they're not going to list that person as a reference because they're trying to get a new job somewhere else.
Thanks, Laura. And I think we've seen some folks in the chat. They can be faked. They're, no one is going to put those things on their resume, on their references, for someone who's not going to give that positive feedback. So I think that's kind of where we've been landing, is that this is not necessarily something we should include. But Judy, please. Oh, Judy, you're still muted. Thank you.
Sorry about that. So in the child welfare world, there's a requirement to check with previous agencies, or in host home world, it would be also perhaps current agencies, and they're required to check with the agency, which gives the previous agency a little bit of a safety net, to be honest. So I think that reference check holds a lot more weight than the provider being able to select who they want to have as the reference.
Sure, Joshua.
Thanks. Specifically on the point of references, I think it's a great suggestion, but like many people are saying here, it's one data point that can be challenging to get accurate picture of a person's history working in the field. There's one thing from the chat that I wanted to highlight from, I forget who raised the point, but I wanted to highlight it, that the Compare Facilities website on the CDPH&E website, that tool for examining PASAs and host homes is not sufficient for someone to really be able to navigate or understand some of the past challenges that a PASA has experienced. I think there needs to be a public-facing scorecard for PASA and providers. We live in a ratings-based world, and I don't know how we can do that better or differently, but it's definitely a need out there. And then the last point that I wanted to raise is independent financial audit. A lot of mismanagement of funds, a lot of misuse and exploitation of funds is happening, and not always taken on by APS and investigated and resolved. And it continues to be an issue. Thank you.
Thanks, Joshua. Okay, some more chats. Let's see. Background checks, I think we're just trying to come to some form of agreement on a few of these different things as we move forward with future topics, and trying to cover what resources and authority HCPF needs to make additional changes. I think the consensus also was background checks are great, federal checks even better, fingerprint requirements seem to be way too expensive and not necessary. Is that still kind of the consensus of folks? If we were to say background checks, and should we say federal background checks, just background checks? What are folks' thoughts there? Okay, so we've got some folks thinking fingerprint is critical. Others saying state and federal, yes. And what I'm curious of is, if I saw a lot in the chat that if folks are doing DMV checks or whatever it might be, they're passing these costs on to the independent contractor. So whoever it may be, host home provider, what have you. If you were to pass along the $40 fingerprint background check, the $10 motor vehicle check, are those things that are going to be something that those host home providers can do? Is this going to make or break things? Is this something that the PASA is comfortable taking the cost on, or does it need to be passed on? Just kind of trying to think through some of those are these things that your organization already does? And so this is no big deal. Just kind of trying to think through some of those logistics. I think I'm seeing that, like, yes, generally folks want to see them, and passing on the cost as a factor. Okay. And then a couple years. I've also seen in the chat, I want to go to this, is the discussion about CDPHE and enforcement. And I think there's certainly challenges, and I'm hearing loud and clear that you can have all the rules in the world, but if there's nobody to enforce them, there's no teeth, and they're really not effective. And I think CDPHE is definitely, as you are all aware, probably based on your own survey timelines and when CDPHE has gotten out there, that there's absolutely some delay in getting to that every 3-year cycle. And so CDPHE is working on catching up with those. And we're working hand in hand with them on that survey process. And I've also heard, how CDPHE picks samples maybe is not always logical or makes the most sense, because the same host home provider has been picked 3 years in a row and some have not. So I think we welcome some other suggestions. So that's absolutely one that we're taking in and discussing with CDPHE, is how those survey samples are selected. If there's some other items that you have that you believe would make the survey process smoother, more efficient, things that you feel are really bogged down the process or what have you. We want to hear about those as well, because we want to make the survey process more efficient, have it run smoother, and that will ensure that folks are getting surveyed on that regularly. So any suggestions there are certainly appreciated. And I think there's just so many components to this whole topic. So whether it's how we reinforce or enforce things on the CDPHE side, or how we would need broader regulatory authority, or the bad actors, whatever you might want to call that list of terminated providers, additional rules. I think just this is a huge topic for us to try and cover. And so we're just trying to take little bites out of there. So also if folks have a suggestion on topics that they'd like to see covered, or how we might go about this process, we're welcome any feedback. But we have about 5 minutes. I really would love to see more folks chime in. If there's any additional thoughts that you want to share verbally instead of just in the chat, I would welcome someone else speaking in here. But otherwise,
Cassie, I'd like to move on. We have a few more slides that I just want to touch base on.
Gotcha.
And then, Maureen, I do see your hand is raised. One moment and I will call on you. So for the logistics, the next meeting is scheduled for February 21st. That will be a discussion, continuing the monitoring discussion, as well as discussing complaints and grievances. Please also continue to check our Host Home Oversight Stakeholder Workgroup website for updates and meeting agendas. The agendas and slideshows are posted there prior to our meeting, so you can always look back at those. Victoria, next slide, please. So focus groups. This is something that is being run by Mission Analytics, and we want your feedback. So there are different focus groups that they will be scheduling times for individuals and family members, host home providers, provider agencies, case managers, advocacy groups. 1 hour meeting per focus group will be held in late February or early March. So not a very big time commitment, but we do want to hear from you. If you are interested, definitely fill out the survey of what kind of group you would like to be involved in. And Victoria, if you would mind just dropping that link into the chat. Thank you, JP. I appreciate it.
And also feel free to forward that link to other folks if, you know, we want to make sure that we get good representation. We know, you know, we may not have that many people on this call with lived experience, and, you know, would really love to make sure we include that focus as well as providers. So really do feel free to share that link with others.
Thank you, Peggy. Next slide. Okay, Maureen, your hand was raised first, and then we'll go to Christina.
Hi, this is Maureen. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
Okay, perfect. I just wanted to say that the explosion of PASAs and the demand on CDPHE, clearly their technology needs upgrade. Clearly they don't have enough staff. Are they really the best agency to be doing the surveys? Right now they're very reactive and they're not proactive. They tend to only do investigations when there's complaints. I see some thumbs coming up the screen. And I just want to ask that broader question. Maybe we need to consider in those focus groups or elsewhere, are they really the best to be doing those surveys? Perhaps there is another way to get more eyes in these different homes. Thank you.
Thank you, Maureen. Christina?
Hi, everyone. Thank you. Back to the PASA situation. It's really, really hard to know what PASA to go with when you have so many that you are having to sift through. I think that's where the problem starts. I know of PASAs in our community. I'm in the Colorado Springs community that a host home provider was let go by multiple agencies, investigated, police involvement, DA has their name, and they've opened a PASA. So I think where it starts is at that PASA level and making sure that when PASAs are opening, there's a much stricter set of guidelines and expectations around brand new PASAs, making sure that they have everything in place before even looking at host homes. That's where it starts at that PASA level. And then it just filters down. And I think when you see multiple providers jumping ship, where are they jumping to? And looking at those provider agencies is where it needs to start, in my opinion. Thank you.
Thank you, Christina. So we are at time for today. We will stay on for a bit longer in case there's additional questions that you would like put into the chat. If you have any questions following this meeting, please feel free to reach out to Victoria Rogers at victoria.rogers@state.co.us, as well as you can always reach us at our HCBS questions inbox, which is HCPF_HCBS_questions@state.co.us. And thank you all for joining us today. Again, your feedback is crucial to the success of this project, and we absolutely love hearing from you. I hope you have a wonderful day. Thank you.
How do I get out? It's not letting me out.